Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Let's start with this morning's news, which really isn't a surprise, is that the budget for 2023-2024 passed, pretty much going along coalition opposition lines, with a significant, or at least according to Israeli politics, a significant majority in the coalition of 4. This was going to be relatively plain sailing once some of the other issues were dealt with. And of course, as there always is before a budget, there are last-minute issues. There are parties jostling for position, especially budgets. And we saw that with the ultra-Orthodox party, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism, which threw in some last-minute demands for more money for the Torah learners, people who basically learn full-time and don't work, and also greater budgets for the unregistered or unofficial ultra-Orthodox school system, which was not funded and which does not teach what's called basic subjects, which is usually maths, language, etc. There was a bit of drama in the lead up to the budget yesterday when the legal advisor of the finance ministry said you can't add more money to the budget because it's got to come from somewhere. And there was this very interesting decision where it was stated that the money would actually come from surplus from other ministries. And the official advisor, the legal advisor said, how can you know if there'll be surplus or extra at the end of the year when we're still in the middle of the year? So I can't really sanction that. But in the end, it was worked out. It was mostly drama for the sake of drama. Everyone knew that there was going to be no chance this government would fall over the budget. Netanyahu knew that. And in the end, there were compromises, not just for the ultra-Orthodox parties, but also Itamar Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudi party, which basically wanted more money for their Negev and Galil ministry and more money for to recruit more policemen. The end of the budget, which is something close to 1 trillion shekels, there was 14 billion shekels in what's called coalition funds, which is usually extra sort of, for want of a better word, extracurricular funds, which are basically used as discretionary. I don't want to use slush funds, but basically discretionary funds, which are allowed to be used for whatever the parties that are allocated it want to use it for. And again, we saw almost half of that, or something close to half of that, being given to the ultra-Orthodox parties for their Torah learners, for their schools, etc. This was obviously slammed by the opposition, but in the Knesset, where these things count, there really wasn't much that they could do with it, about it. And there was a lot of time allocated for the budget debates, and they certainly put up a lot of queries throughout the time, but they were passed through pretty quickly. And around 6 o'clock this morning, the final budget readings were passed, and we now have a budget. What does that mean for Israeli politics? Well, the one word, which is the most important, is stability. And as I have been saying, since these webinars have begun, that is at the root of a lot of what Israeli politics is about, because our system lends itself to instability. Anything that creates greater stability in the system is obviously always welcomed by those who are in the coalition. And what this does do is almost certainly give this government at least another year and a half until the end of 2024, when they will have to then vote on the 2025 budgets. Why is that important? First of all, because this is obviously a coalition where it does have different views, it does have different ideologies. And as I've said since the beginning, it is a government where really, that no one really has too many other options. Perhaps the ultra-Orthodox parties do, but certainly the right-wing parties don't. And as long as Netanyahu remains the head of the Likud don't really have too many other options. We did speak about Benny Gantz, and still the questions are asked of Benny Gantz almost every time he appears in the media. Could you join the government over these circumstances? Could you join if this one left? Could you join if that one left? His answer is unequivocal no, and I'm sure that's true for the moment, but things could change, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down the line. But what it does do is it certainly cuts off a lot of leverage from Netanyahu's partners in the coalition, because while you have such a vital and important vote as the budget, because as I've explained before, previously, if the budget does not pass by a certain date, and that was May 29th, the government immediately falls automatically and we go to elections. So, there was quite a lot of leverage for Netanyahu's partners to try and bully him, blackmail him, whatever you want to call it, to make sure that they got their piece of the pie for the budget, for their ministries, for their communities, for their populations, whatever it could be. But now they don't have as much leverage, and this government really can only end in the next 18 months if there is a law to disperse the Knesset. And obviously, that can only come about if one of the parties decides to drop out, or Netanyahu decides he's had enough of this. But the overwhelming sense is that there will be a certain amount of stability. Not to say that there will not be any rows, and certainly there are a few issues coming up on the horizon which will cause some disquiet within the coalition. First of all, something about the opposition claim that this is a budget which does not meet the needs of the public at such a time where cost of living is really sky high. The shekel is constantly weakening. The interest rate has gone up, I don't know how many times in the last year, from 0.025 to now something like 4.75. And it doesn't seem to be abating. The opposition would claim that this is a budget which doesn't do much to stop that, but Netanyahu again has achieved what he meant to do. He's meant to get the budget through, meant to placate his partners, meant to ensure a certain amount of stability for certainly what will be challenging times ahead. Now the question is, does this government pivot immediately back to judicial reform? As we know, judicial reform was put on the back burner because of the budget considerations and votes. And interestingly, in the early hours of the morning when the budget was assured, Netanyahu walks past some journalists, and one of them asks him, does that mean we're now going back to judicial reform? And he said, of course, it's back on the table. Now, it probably, I wouldn't say it was a slip of the tongue, but certainly to calm emotions, it's clear that Netanyahu felt that he needed to, because he put out at least two statements after that saying, he wants to give a chance for the opposition and coalition to come to an agreement, the spirit of compromise, et cetera, because as you can imagine, those early morning comments were jumped on by the opposition saying, Netanyahu has no interest in compromise. The talks at the president's office to achieve a compromise on the issue of judicial reform are a sham. This is what they were claiming. So it was very important for Netanyahu to get out not in front, because this was in reaction, to try and calm the nerves. What's very important to note is there's an important day coming up, June 15th, because that is when the Judicial Committee meets for the first time. And the Judicial Committee is an extremely important part of the judicial process, and thus attempted judicial reform, because at present, this government and its supporters will claim that the decision makers or the democratically elected officials still have a minority on the Judicial Selection Committee. And that's one of the main things, especially for judicial reform architect Yariv Levin, is to change the makeup of that. So the government, the coalition, has a majority that it can then be able to implement its agenda without the Supreme Court constantly, this is what they would argue, putting barriers ahead of them. So it's very interesting to see what will happen. There are some suggestions that Yariv Levin may not convene as the Justice Minister. It's an argument whether he has the power, but there are those who suggest that Yariv Levin will not convene the Judicial Appointments Committee while he's still trying to change that makeup. What else happened this week is also very interesting. Some argue that it was partly to sort of distract and deflect the population and the media from what was going on in the budget and judicial reform. Is really the temperature was raised significantly on Israel's rivals, enemies, opponents in the region. First of all, we had the head of IDF intelligence who spoke at the Herzliya conference, and certainly was a good opportunity because this is one of the premier conferences on the political and diplomatic and security circuit. But he made news with some very, very rare comments. Usually the head of IDF intelligence doesn't usually go public, especially with the following comments. He basically said he's worried that Hezbollah may make an error like they did, which set off the Second Lebanon War, where Hassan Nasrallah basically directed his Hezbollah troops to go across the border and attack Israel. And what Israel likes to bring up many, many times since is Nasrallah admitted that if he had known the level of response by Israel, he probably wouldn't have instigated that particular conflict. So you had the IDF intelligence head who's saying, we feel that they may be heading in that direction. He spoke very tellingly about maybe some sort of imminent attack. And that certainly set a lot of tongues wagging because these were very rare comments on something very, very specific that came out of the IDF head of intelligence's mouth. Also, we heard this week that Iran has possibly another site for its nuclear weapons program. This one very deep underground, which at first was suggested to be impenetrable to most bunker buster bombs. Certainly, it was suggested what Israel has got. And the IDF chief of staff basically coming up with comments that says, there are, at the same conference, by the way, there are negative developments which could prompt action. Now that set off even more tongues wagging, and obviously had a lot of people suggesting that Israel could be on the way, on the path imminently to taking some firm action. And it certainly had, it was suggested by some economists that it actually had an effect on the economic situation and further weaken the shekel. There's a debate exactly what weakened the shekel, but many commentators have suggested that these comments by the IDF chief of staff certainly didn't help the situation. But it's clear that Iran is very much on the mind of Israel's decision makers because Tzachi Hanegbi, who also holds a prominent position in Netanyahu's security establishment, came out and said that there's nowhere that Israel can't reach. He actually didn't say there's nowhere Israel can't reach, there's nowhere we can't reach. And a lot of people suggested, was he talking about Israel? Was he talking about America? Was he talking about us working with America? And Netanyahu also came out with comments basically saying that no, none of our enemies, none of our opponents in the region should be dismissive. We are way ahead of you. He spoke very confidently that whatever is going on, we know exactly what's going on, and we're way ahead of our opponents and enemies in the region. So there was a lot of talk about Hezbollah, which is obviously an Iranian tentacle, very, very close on Israel's northern border, and Iran itself. It's clear that things are happening in Iran, and it's clear that the Israeli security establishment has a very keen eye on it, and whether something's imminent or not, it's obviously way above my pay grade, but it's clear that a lot of messages wanted to be sent out this week, some straight to Iran, some to the American establishment or other allies who could possibly help in thwarting the Iranian nuclear weapons program. But it's clear that Israel is concerned about developments in Iran, and that's what probably led to this volley of comments about it. Another development that came out this week is the possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia. Reports came out that things are moving, and the demands were made. Saudi Arabia has certain demands from America, which we've spoken about in the past, help with their own nuclear program, some sort of defense pact, et cetera, et cetera. From Israel, it came out, its demands of Israel are to stop the judicial reform, which is interesting, or at least in coordination with America. And the Saudis are very keen on not just some process with the Palestinians, but something more substantive. It's clear that the Saudis, as opposed to the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and others, probably can't get up too far ahead without something on the Palestinians. They've said many, many times in the past that they will not fully normalize and accept Israel officially without the Palestinians. Exactly what that means, we'll have to see. But it's clear that there are some very substantive demands. Many are connecting or comparing it to when a Netanyahu government wanted to place sovereignty on Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and in the end, he gave it up for normalizations with a slew of our countries, the Abraham Accords, et cetera, et cetera. So some are saying that it's possible that maybe he will give up on judicial reform and some other things. People have said maybe there'll be another freeze on the settlements for normalization with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, will be a whole new level, far above any of the current Abraham Accords. But what is going to be tricky is he's got a government which will not want to prioritize, and already voices have come out and said, if it means giving up on judicial reform, if it means a freeze on the settlements, if it means a substantive peace process with the Palestinians, we prefer to give up any normalization with Saudi Arabia. And if one looks at the ideological components of this government, it's very easy to see why they would say that. But at the end of the day, Netanyahu has managed to get his way. Perhaps this is a ladder by the international community, by the Saudis, by the Americans, which anyway he wants. There are many suggesting that the judicial reform issue got out of hand, and now he's looking for an elegant way and a win to give up on it. But he's certainly, if he does, he's certainly going to have a fight with pretty much all of his coalition partners and some major figures within the Likud party. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. But it's clear things are moving on the Saudi track, but whether it becomes more substantive, we'll have to wait and see. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee asking, can you comment on the money that the IDF received in the budget? And Robert CD follows up, is the IDF satisfied with the budget?
I actually haven't looked at the budget, I'll be honest. It's quite a large document. I didn't hear too much come out from the defense establishment. Usually you hear some noises if they feel that they're not getting enough. Usually there's an increase in the defense budget somehow, and perhaps even the statements that were coming out of the major security and defense officials were sort of to put forward the idea and the concept that the security establishment must be well budgeted. It's probably not a full coincidence that these comments came out in this week. And the defense budget is a holy cow in Israel, and it's very, very rarely touched, never brought down, and usually very rarely stagnant. It usually moves up. And with the fact that people are talking about the threat from Hezbollah. We just recently had a conflict with Islamic Jihad and Hamas, whatever role that they played, and with Iran moving forward ever closer to nuclear weapons capability, there wouldn't be too much support for a lowering of the budget, but I can't talk to the absolute figures until I've studied the budget in a little bit more detail.
Thank you. Barak Korkmaz asks, is Israel getting ready for a three-front war against Iranian proxies, namely Hamas, PIJ, Hezbollah? And if yes, do you think things might spill over into Iran?
Well, first of all, there could be many more fronts. Syria is another possible front. The Houthis in Yemen, although we don't have a direct border, have been, sending signals that they would like in some way to be involved. There's also groups in Iraq. I mean, again, not necessarily an imminent threat, but Iran has very carefully tried to collate these different threats together. They've been very keen on trying to coordinate all their different proxies in the region, and some which are not necessarily proxies like Hamas, but certainly, get quite a lot of Iranian assistance and largesse. So there has been this talk of Iran being able to affect perhaps a multi-pronged attack on Israel, especially if it feels that it's being threatened. That is one of the threats. That's part of the leverage that it would like to place over Israel, that, if there's any sort of attack on Iran itself, it has a multi-pronged response from Lebanon, from Syria, from Gaza, from Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and maybe from beyond. So this is something that the Iranians have been working on. The Israeli security establishment, the IDF, certainly is aware of this, has been preparing for this. I know the home front is constantly preparing for multi-pronged attacks. What happens if we're attacked at the same time from the north and the south? That hasn't really happened in the past, not in a significant way, but it would certainly stretch Israel's capability to their limit if we were attacked from two different directions, both defensively and offensively, and Iran knows it. But the Israeli defense establishment is preparing for such an eventuality, and if, as the chief of staff hinted today, and again it's just a hint, that action may need to be taken in the near future if Iran continues hurtling towards nuclear weapons capability, and it has to take action, then it will face a response from many different directions.
Thank you. Eric asks, are there still protests every week about the judicial changes? And especially now that there's a budget, what do you predict will happen in the near future with that?
Well, they haven't stopped. Every single Saturday night, I think the last one, they are getting slightly smaller. Last one was, I think, 120,000, down from at one point it was 250,000. It's very hard to get the same people out for the same issue week after week. So they try and, focus on different issues. Last week, it was very much trying to focus on the budget, on especially the amounts that were given to the ultra-Orthodox community, which they believe doesn't help the ultra-Orthodox community, first and foremost, get out of a cycle of poverty, allow itself to be able to contribute to society by working, because if you don't teach basic subjects, you can't then go and have too much of a professional existence after. So they would claim it's the ultra-Orthodox politicians, and I was in Tel Aviv today, and these posters are everywhere, blaming Bibi, blaming Aryeh Deri of Shas, blaming the two leaders of United Torah Judaism, and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, of course, but basically saying that this is a budget which is just not going to help Israeli society, but it's actually going to retard the growth and progress of Israeli society and its economy, especially at a time, as I said, where prices are rising across the board in multiple directions. So they do have a bit of fire in their belly, especially if there is a return to try and push the judicial reform. What has been stated quite a lot is essentially true, is there are a couple of elements of judicial reform, because as we as we know, they split it up into various elements rather than trying to push it forward in one go, that at least two of the elements are almost ready for a final vote. So they could be brought to the Knesset in the morning, theoretically be voted on that same day. So there really isn't too much wiggle room for the opposition at this point. So they really are trying to keep the heat up on the government. And Benny Gantz said, and Yair Lapid has threatened, and various others, that if judicial reform does go through, this country will be, halted, and there'll be mass protest, et cetera, et cetera. So, it hasn't abated. It's still going. I wouldn't say it's losing steam, but obviously, as I said, you're always going to lose certain numbers if you come out same time, same week, same issue. Not everyone could do that week after week, but the opposition is raising a lot of money. When I say the opposition, I'm not talking about necessarily the political opposition. I'm talking about the protest opposition. They have raised a lot of money, and they declared that in the last couple of days very proudly. And they said that they have many tools left. They haven't got going yet, and they haven't even used some of the more important tactics that they would claim that they can use if they feel that it's getting to a point of no return.
Thank you. So Carrie Hillebrand asks, how much longer can Israel continue as an economically viable state with an ever-growing Haredi population? It doesn't share in the equal economic burden and defense burden. And is that a true statement?
It's a very thorny statement. It's, if you simply do the maths without any emotion, without any possible change, yes, it becomes eventually unsustainable, because the ultra-Orthodox birth rate is much higher than any other birth rate. Even if you take out the Arab population, or if you leave them in, today I think they're about 12%. Demographers have said by, I think it's 2050, there'll be 25%. That's a significant amount. And not to say, you shouldn't tar a whole community with one brush and say none of them work, none of them contribute. Plenty do, but certainly in far less significant numbers than the average Israeli. But they do benefit in greater numbers, or in greater packages than the average Israeli. I think it was the Bank of Israel that came out recently with numbers that said that non-ultra-Orthodox Israelis contribute 3 times as much as ultra-Orthodox Israelis, but benefit the ultra-Orthodox benefit 3 times as much. So obviously that's an unsustainable model if the community that's benefiting more but contributing less is growing. It is hoped at some point that that some of these trends will change. Perhaps more ultra-Orthodox will go into the army, will contribute to the tax burden, but obviously something has to be done about this. And this budget, the opposition have said, does nothing to this except make the situation worse, because it's now funding a whole system of people, of children who will not matriculate with even basic skills in maths, in language, in English, in sciences, etc., etc.
Thank you. And you mentioned the cost of living is skyrocketing and the interest rates are going up. Do you think that the budget has addressed this at all, or is there room for improvement?
Oh, there's always room for improvement. Well, Netanyahu tried to put a good spin on it, that stability is what helps the economy, and certainly economists look for that. So far, the reaction from the markets hasn't necessarily been positive. As I said, the shekel has actually weakened, and the Bank of Israel had to raise interest rate. There was a hint by the head of the Bank of Israel that this would be the last time interest rates would be raised, but there was also a hint a few interest rate rises ago. So this may not be the last one. So far, nothing this government has done has really stopped the rise. And almost every other day we hear about a rise in the price of bread, milk products, gas, which is expected to rise again in the next couple of days. property isn't really going down significantly. There was talk of this fund where municipalities would pay into, the stronger ones would pay into, who have more municipal taxes from businesses, that would help some of those areas where they can't really attract businesses because they're in the periphery and away from the center of the country and the economic centers and the political centers, that they would actually help them and give money from the stronger municipalities to the weaker ones. Some like to point out that Netanyahu, as a strong capitalist, is acting very much against his values. But the government and Smotrich, who's no less of a capitalist, justify this, that it's necessary because we need to strengthen the periphery, because if people, there's less jobs there, there's more poverty there, so they need to be strengthened in the short term to help them get on their feet, to be able to attract greater business, greater opportunities in the long term. That's the case that's been made. But at the moment, this government hasn't really been successful, nor was the last one, and even the one before that, of managing to get the cost of living down. But again, that's not necessarily unique to Israel because of the geopolitical situation with Russia, Ukraine. Still, we're being affected by the economic situation after COVID. So certainly Israel is not unique in that, but that doesn't really help the average Israeli, who just sees that their supermarket bills are going up, that their rent is going up, that their municipal taxes are going up. So there's certainly a lot of disquiet on that level, and Netanyahu would certainly like to start at least pushing some things down and getting some wins on the economic front, because very much he's trusted by much of his supporter base as a man who understands economics and a man who's able to deal with some of these challenging issues.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
First, for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Javad Hashmi discussing who will lead American Islam. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.